So, according to the agenda, we're meant to be finishing in 5 minutes before, I think, promised there are drinks and... Oh, it'd be helpful if that mic was on. So, we're meant to be finishing in 5 minutes. We've got time for a few questions from the audience, just on the speakers that have just taken place. So, does anyone have any questions for our speakers today? Anyone want to kick us off? Yes, sorry, the gentleman just in the middle there.
Yeah, so I think this for Pelican. I think it's easy where you already have.
Oh, sorry, do you want to? Sorry, my colleague's just going to bring a mic for you. Might be a bit easier for everyone else.
Yeah, so So in an industry where we are faced with a very quick or fast-paced regulatory changes, how quickly is the AI system to make sure you're keeping in line with the changes and not failing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the underlying aspect of the automation solution is exactly that. It needs to be automated, and that automation needs to be achieved in a time-bound fashion, right? So, there are certain aspects where if there's a change, we actually work with the banks and the corporates to understand what that change is about, and we agree on an SLA in terms of how much time does it take to sort of get that change implemented within the system.
But what if it's a live transaction where it's actually being a country who is being suspended or sanctioned? How is this quickly implemented in your system? The bank is protected.
Yes, it's real time. Yeah. So there are, sanction screening. Whenever there's an update in the sanction list, I'm assuming that's what you're asking, right? That is real time. So as soon as the data is updated and made available to us, the flags and the blocks happen in real time. So there is no lag in terms of the update that's made available to us and the time it takes to implement that.
And one last question is for any of the speakers that spoke. So we have different and rising sanction regimes. So how do you effectively navigate through of these sanction regimes?
If any of our speakers, Rebecca, I could see you poised to maybe answer that. If you wanted to come up onto the front just so that everyone can then also hear you, and also welcome Tracy and also Sean to come up on the front if there are any questions from the audience as well. Sorry, Rebecca, to land you in that one.
Navigating the sanctions regime. I think what I said is the most accurate way in which you can represent this. You have to think about the sanctions regime as a dynamic and fluid situation that needs to be managed from a political risk point of view as well as legal and technical point of view. So actually, I think one of the things that probably isn't happening at the moment, which is why when Russia first invaded Ukraine, the automatic thing that banks do is shut everything down because they just can't guarantee whether they're complying or not. Actually, monitoring that type of risk and understanding where sanctions are likely to be the next thing that is implemented as a weapon in sort of our whole national security framework. I think understanding it as a geopolitical risk element as well is becoming increasingly important. As I said during the panel, a lot of that is because we're seeing things come in which are normally associated with terrorist financing that are actually now being used against states. So the whole situation just needs to be looked at in terms of bigger geopolitical, geoeconomic conflict, I would argue. And that would be the one thing that I would say, it's joining the dots between different parts of compliance and risk functions in banks. But you're the lawyer.
Yeah, look, I mentioned over-compliance, and you're right, there's always an overreaction when a new regime comes in. I think technology maybe can help us to understand the supply chain, which we need to anyway, because of the wave of upcoming ESG regulation here and in Europe. But I think ultimately it does come down to actually what I'll pass on to you then, Tracy, because it's about know your customer. Where are the risks? If there's a difficulty, I think, with US dollars, right? And it was a difficulty that was reflected in that decision, that English decision that I mentioned. But it's actually really important to know what currencies and therefore, what regimes sanctions regimes you are likely to trigger, knowing where your customer does business, how it does business. There's this whole world, this fascinating world of the IoT, the Internet of Things, trackers, the extent to which we as banks actually have to possess as much information as in fact sometimes even more than some of the three-letter agencies do. But Tracy,
I agree totally with what Sean was saying. It's so hard to keep on top of it, to keep the timeline, because as you say, how do you know if something happens, if there's a sanction that comes in, we literally have to stop any new transactions. It's a complete stop. And then obviously then you have to go back and look back on all your manual inflow business to see, is there an issue there? Is there something that we need to pick up? And if you're in a big organisation like I work in, you're talking about many thousands of transactions. That's a hard ask for us to meet. And as Sean was saying, knowing your customers, this is something that is a continual enhancement that our compliance teams, our KYC teams are trying to come up with new ways of understanding. And at the same time, we have to educate our relationship teams, our coverage teams, our originations teams to understand their clients' business, to see where the flags are, to see what they need to dig into more. It's a circular issue. We go round in circles trying to come up with better solutions because we're acting as policemen for something that basically we're trying to do international trade, but we're also trying to be a policeman. Foot soldiers, definitely. Yeah. Yes.
And I'd add one last thing to that, which is this need to work with government agencies, because you said quite rightly, banks have the type of data that only the three-letter agencies have. The three-letter agencies have data that even government departments within those three-letter agencies don't have. And actually what we need to start doing, because this is becoming a critical part of national security strategy, is bringing those data sources together into a shared utility. And that's a much bigger conversation about relationships with governments and international security services. But I think there is awareness on the other side of the fence, if you see what I mean, that's something that's got to be done.
It can't be made to be our problem. It's not our problem, it's exactly. Everybody's problem.
And I think that's why we're seeing something very different with sanctions coming in now. So because the bank's the legal system is having something done to it where it is suddenly expected to react and change everything in a nanosecond. If that is the nature of our new sanctions world that we're living in, and the nature of economic conflict that we're living in, then actually the banks need to be speaking on a day-by-day basis operationally with government. And I think that is something that's very, very different. Yeah,
I know that's also part of the whole expectation of the regulators as well. You're quite right, Rebecca, and you and I have spoken about this before, that there is a lot of data out there which is useful to banks, would be useful to banks if they are expected to be the policeman, that in fact we really are. That is not being given to us. But if in fact the issue is, look, this is going to stop an invasion of Europe by Mr. Putin, then actually we better start doing it. It's very serious stuff.
But then, of course, you have the legal issues. I mean, I was at a conference and was speaking to somebody from OFAC who was saying, but if you share me all your data about your clients, we can do all the investigation. But then we've got GDP, what can we share? You're sort of doing this balancing act. I can't just give somebody data to start digging.
Here, I'll put my legal cape on. It is difficult. Yeah, I think those two judgments that I mentioned are arguably not very commercial in their approach. There are other issues. GDPR is, I always think, is the last refuge of the scoundrel, actually, because it's the law that's always invoked when you don't want to do something. But there are some issues around that. I mean, there are exceptions to GDPR where it's sort of for the public good. I think there is a need for a bigger look at this in view of, as you described, the securitization of sanctions.
Okay, I'm just conscious of time. We've got time for one more question, and then I suggest you stay, have a drink, and I've been promised a nice canapé. So all our speakers are here apart from Miriam. So please do stay and network. So one more question from the audience, please.
Just a small. Do you think sanctions work in achieving their aims?
I think we don't.
They're a start. As I said, imagine we didn't have sanctions. Is it conceivable ethically, commercially, politically that we should just be trading oil, for example, with Russia at whatever price? The market price now is above the cap. Is the cap working? Probably not perfectly, but there is some very, very, very definitive shaking of our head there. But imagine we didn't have it. You know, it's look. There was a Peloponnesian War in 2 BC, wasn't there? But it's one of the things that I think it's one of the tools that we have to have. I mean, Miriam was very skeptical about sanctions. I've been skeptical about sanctions, but honestly, not having them, I think, is worse.
So I'll add to that. I don't think we had any other option if geopolitically at the time when Russia invaded Ukraine. And this is I want to keep emphasizing this. This is a massive shift in the way in which sanctions are being used geostrategically around the world. President Putin was invoking his own nuclear doctrine at that moment in time. It was not possible for the Allies to move into Ukraine and fight a kinetic war at that moment in time. So the only option, and believe you me, President Putin's economists will have modelled this, the only option was to impose sanctions. They knew exactly what we were going to do and exactly how it was going to unfold, which is why it's difficult to keep everybody on side, why we've now got a huge diplomatic strategic issue of non-aligned countries which can go in both directions, and that's making the situation worse, and why I as an economist would say, well, you always get diversion effects, which actually mean that they are always, after a period of time, going to nominally fail. But what we have done is we've excluded Russia from the sort of international rules-based order. I always end on a really cheerful note. We need to be very careful, very wary what we wish for, because the speaker right at the beginning said, well, they've already got their own, they're a central bank, digital currencies that could come in that mean that the whole system separates out. So we have to be very wary what we wish for at this moment in time, but there was no alternative.
Yeah, I mean, I saw an exhibition of captured Russian equipment destroyed captured Russian equipment in Prague a year or so ago, and looking inside the burnt out shell of one of their tanks, T-72 or something, there was a Thales, the French company, fire control computer. Now, that was the T-72 is an old tank. They probably had that for a while, but that is no longer possible. They're using, if they need it, they've got lots of tanks apparently. If they need it, they're having to go elsewhere. We know what's happening with drones. You know, it's being supplied by Iran. Is that, but at least, yeah, and are they as good as? It's part of the war, right? We are at war, I'm afraid. Tracy.
I think, let me add any more to what you've already said. It's not, we want to have a positive thing. I mean, yeah, but we're not being very positive at the moment. But no, I don't think it's just not a solution ultimately, but it's all we had at the time.
Okay, so just before I hand back over to Dave Maynell, who's should be having listened intently to the whole session online, just to let everyone know, this is being all recorded. If any of your colleagues would like to gain access, please get in touch, but we'll send out a link after the event so that everyone can get access to the session online afterwards. Over to you, Dave, to do some closing remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie, and thanks to all the speakers. This was a really insightful and fascinating masterclass today, and every session was at such a high standard. Between you all, you've covered numerous nuances with regard to the subject of sanctions, and there's no doubt that this particular masterclass has set us a very high bar for those that follow later on in the year. As we've heard, trade finance is subject to an intricate web of sanctions that are imposed by governments, international bodies, etc. And as the speakers have mentioned, these sanctions are not static. They evolve in response to geopolitical shifts, emerging threats, and changes in global diplomacy. And there's actually been quite a few items in the UK press recently regarding the formation of an Office of Trade Sanctions Implementation. And they're going to work with their partners across government and in industry to help ensure that businesses understand trade sanctions and that they are properly implemented and enforced in the UK. So the OTSI, as they're going to be known, are currently in a setup phase, and they're going to be up and running this year once their new legal powers are in force. And they're going to have 3 responsibilities. The first is the civil enforcement of trade sanctions, including the power to issue trade monetary policies or penalties, which is opposed to the criminal enforcement of trade sanctions offences, which the HMRC still remain with. They look at trade sanctions business engagement and guidance. And thirdly, monitoring of compliance with trade sanctions to detect breaches, including investigating suspected trade sanction breaches. So as such, this workshop was clearly not only appropriate, but very timely. One other issue that we probably didn't get a chance to look at that does require consideration is what are the ethical considerations in imposing trade sanctions, especially regarding their impacts on civilian populations. Addressing the moral dilemmas posed by sanctions, including humanitarian issues, is a big subject. Probably one we didn't get time to really look at it today because there's so much else we touched on, but it's something for us to bear in mind. Having said that, I hope that we provided you with actionable insights and practical strategies that you can implement in your trade finance functions. It's been a great seminar. I'd like to thank both the ICC UK for arranging and Cleary Gottlieb for hosting. Enjoy the drinks, enjoy the networking, and we hope to see you all again later this year at a future ICC event.
Thank you, Dave. And sorry you can't be here. Fantastic. Like I say, if you've got any ideas for future ICC events on trade finance, please talk to us. It's just being served outside and canapes, and we have. Thank you.
I talked to her.